If Christ is king, how should the Christian consider the kingdoms of this world? What does the Bible teach us about human authority and what it means to love our neighbors and our enemies? Before we render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, let's know what it means to render unto God what is God's. This is the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, the modern prophetic voice against war and empire.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I am your host, Jacob Winograd. Last week, we tackled more of the objections to biblical anarchy that ChatGPT created for us. And I do plan on using the questions that we went over to dive deeper into a few topics in some of the upcoming episodes. And continuing the series of sort of, expanding the case for biblical anarchy that I've been doing since the beginning of the new year, or I guess the end of last year. I can't quite remember. But today I want to do something a little different. So I've mentioned Murray Rothbard a lot in my thesis episode, What is Biblical Anarchy? And in passing as well, just in various episodes. And for you libertarians out there, I presume you already know who Murray Rothbard is. And so this episode will be a little bit of review. But for those who don't know or aren't as familiar at the very least, I'm going to do a short episode where I'm going to read an excerpt from the book Anatomy of the State, which I should have checked. I know I have a copy of this somewhere, and I just don't know where it is off the top of my head. It's behind me somewhere on the bookshelf. Maybe you guys can spot it out if you zoom in really close, or it might be even covered up there. I'm not sure. But it's a real short book. Like, you can even find the PDF version online. I mean, I think it's, depending on which version you get and the type font, I mean, it might be, 50 pages, 60 pages, something like that. But it's a really important read, I think, that even if you don't come away reading it and being convinced of anarcho-capitalism or libertarianism, at least would get you thinking about what the state really is. Because I think a lot of us just are born into this society, raised in the public education system, and we're taught, we're kind of given like a civic education, and one of the things we're taught is just this sort of presumption of the legitimacy of the state. And here in America, especially, this idea of, the government gets its power from the consent of the governed, and the idea of a social contract and all of this. And I think that a lot of libertarian writers, but I think most eloquently done and succinctly done by Murray Rothbard in the work Anatomy of the State, does a really good job at unpacking this idea. Again, this idea that's really embedded into the cultural consciousness of not just America, but just democratic societies in general. But I want to read this, and it's about this idea that, again, the idea that beyond just that the state derives its authority from the consent of the governed, but this idea that we live in a society that exhibits the characteristics of self-governance, or that we are the government, essentially, right? Like, I think we've heard that phrase before. And I think this is really a dangerous mindset, really sinister mindset, actually, that is sort of a very subtle mind virus that's implanted in our heads that really leads to, it can lead to very dangerous places. And Rothbard does a good job at exposing that. So let's go ahead and read this excerpt that I have pulled up here. So this is from Rothbard, no edits or cuts or anything, from Anatomy of the State. If we are the government, then anything a government does to an individual is not only just and untyrannical, but also voluntary on the part of the individual concerned. If the government has incurred a huge public debt, which must be paid by taxing one group for the benefit of another, this reality of burden is obscured by saying that we owe it to ourselves. If the government conscripts a man or throws him into jail for dissident opinion, then he is, quote, doing it to himself. And therefore, nothing toward him or untoward him has occurred. Under this reasoning, the Jews murdered by the Nazi government were not murdered. Instead, they must have committed suicide, since they were the government, which was democratically chosen, and therefore anything the government did to them was voluntary on their part. One would not think it necessary to belabor this point, and yet the overwhelming bulk of the people hold this fallacy to a greater or lesser degree. We must therefore emphasize that we are not the government. The government is not us. The government does not in any accurate sense represent the majority of the people. But even if it did, even if 70% of the people decided to murder the remaining 30%, this would still be murder and would not be voluntary suicide on the part of the slaughtered minority. No organicist metaphor, no irrelevant bromide that we are all part of one another must be permitted to obscure this basic fact. So this is why I love Rothbard. He really doesn't mince words. He cuts right to the point. He doesn't sugarcoat things. He names the lie. He rips it up at the root. And we hear this all the time, again, as I mentioned, especially here in America. I think that as Christians, we have to grapple with the idea that we can love America. We can love where we live. We can recognize that we are afforded certain liberties here. We can even look to the founding of America, look to our founding documents and founding story, and identify people, identify themes that we can see good in, that resonate with us. And I can do that, right? I'm not saying like, you can do that and I don't. Like I even do that, right? I think that the Declaration of Independence includes some of the most inspired writings that man has ever written outside the direct writings of, those who are writing the inspired word of sacred scripture. But that said, there are things about the American mythos, right? The founding of America embedded into this story as we are taught it in our, not just in school, but in the prevailing culture, that make us think that our government is special because it derives the consent from the governed, and that we are essentially, that this whole thing is an extension of ourselves, right? And that we have self-government. But I don't think that that's the case, and neither does Rothbard. And this idea of taxation without representation and participatory government is another term, right? And this idea that, well, if you're voting, you're participating in the system and you're voting for representatives to represent you, and therefore that means that you have consented to the things that the government does then. Even things that maybe you would, and there's like a cognitive dissonance there where you're like, well, I didn't vote for this law, but I voted in the election and got the representative that I wanted or didn't want. Either way, like let's use an example that's very close to home. I voted for Donald Trump. I did it for a few select reasons. I did it not even endorsing him necessarily, but just saying that I think he's going to free Ross Ulbricht and might do a few good things that are worth the gamble of all the bad things that I know are going to come with Donald Trump. I did not consent to Donald Trump using my tax money to continue a war in Yemen, or to support Israel's war in Gaza, or to continue the war. He promised to end the war between Ukraine and Russia, and he hasn't delivered on that, right? Here's what people who voted for Trump, who have mind reasoning or whatnot, are not forced to do. We're not forced to own everything that Donald Trump does. We're not forced to be like, well, yeah, I don't like that he's doing that, but I voted for him. So I guess I consented to, that. Like, I don't really have a right to complain, right? Conversely, we often hear the opposite. If you don't vote, you don't have a right to complain, which I also think is completely untrue. But voting is perhaps a form of participation. But democracy does not make us complicit in whatever the state does, and it does not mean that we have consented or are directly doing ourselves whatever the state does. And voting is not an extension of ownership. We can't say that we are self-governing. Putting a slip of paper in a box or the computer, typing on the computer every few years doesn't give me ownership over the IRS. Doesn't give me ownership over the Pentagon. Doesn't give me ownership over the police state or the military industrial complex. And that which I don't own, if I don't own it, I can't control it. If I don't control it, I don't own it. So I can't opt out of it. And if you can't opt out of it, you're not really consenting, right? And consent, I've talked about this on a really old episode, the foundation of what consent is. But for there to be true consent, you have to have informed consent. You have to have the ability to opt out, not just beforehand, but even afterwards. And you don't have the ability to opt out. Even if you don't vote, you are still going to be subject to the outcome of whatever the system says people voted for. And most importantly of all, because the idea of consent and participation matters, but as Rothbard talked about in this, the portion of the essay I read, voting does not change the fundamental moral nature of actions. If something is evil, if something is theft or something is murder, if something is oppressive, it doesn't magically become righteous because a majority voted for it. So Rothbard is right. This lie is dangerous because it turns victims into accomplices in their own victimization, or I'd even go further to say in their own enslavement. The state wants you to believe that you're complicit in its crimes and in all of its actions because you voted. And that is how the state avoids accountability. It's how it protects itself. It's how it gets you to accept a lot of things you don't like because you think that you consented to it, that you voted for it, that, beyond the normal, I think, sort of ideas of like, well, we need the state to have rights and liberty and security, and liberty and society, right? The taxation is the price we pay to live in a civilized society. There's all that. But then there's this extra layer with this idea that Rothbard and I are talking about here, that if you are the government, then you're complicit in everything that happens. And therefore you're going to, even the things you don't like, be less critical of and, not be as inclined to protest. Not being as inclined to have an outrage over. So, but let's tie this back to scripture too, because this is not just a Rothbardian or libertarian insight. I think this is a biblical one. See, like in a text like Romans 13, rulers are described as ministers of God, I'd say like ministers of justice. Now, it's important to say here that they're established by God. It doesn't say that they're appointed by majority vote. Their legitimacy, biblically speaking, doesn't come from democracy. It doesn't even say it comes from consent of the consent of the governed in some other fashion. It says that their authority is derived from God, and there is an implicit, as I've talked about before, there's an implication to that, which is that authority comes from God as they do what they are supposed to do in that position as designated and prescribed by God, right? Just like God establishes the authority of parents, but when parents act outside of that authority, that's not ordained by God. So the legitimacy, biblically speaking, is not democracy or consent of the governed, or we need the state for a civilized society or anything like that. It comes from doing what is just, upholding good and punishing evil. That's what Romans 13 says, that they're there to almost be a terror to those who do evil, but not to those who do good works. And when rulers become evildoers, when they steal, when they murder, when they violate God's standards of justice, I think their power becomes illegitimate. I think their authority becomes illegitimate. It becomes, and it's certainly still evil. When they do evil actions, they are evil regardless of if the majority voted for it. Think about the prophets, right? Like Isaiah, Jeremiah, constantly calling out rulers and kings who had, at the times when they were reigning, they had popular support, right? But they were still committing evil. I just thought, I didn't have this in my notes, but I think about even in my church is going through 2 Samuel, and there was the whole rebellion of Absalom, right? And Absalom had a lot of support. I don't know if the text exactly gives us a breakdown, but you almost get the sense that at least a large portion, perhaps even a majority of Israel, has started to favor Absalom over David, at least, enough that he's able to pull off this, attempted coup of the monarchy. But their evil is still evil, right? Like the things that Absalom did, the things that the different kings of Israel did, just because they had popular support didn't mean that they were ordained by God, didn't mean that they were acting righteously. Think about Jesus. He was crucified because the crowd demanded it. They cried out, "We have no king but Caesar," right? So, that's the fact that the crowd demanded it did not make it right. Majority rule doesn't redeem injustice. In fact, sometimes it often reveals injustice. Sometimes when the majority of society is going one way, we as Christians should stop and think, are we really supposed to go this way? Right? Because I think oftentimes we have to remember our countercultural role. And that doesn't mean that it's like I'm not suggesting a heuristic of just do the opposite of whatever society tells you, right? I'm not saying we should be belligerent or contrarians just for the sake of being contrarian, but we should be skeptical of just going along to get along, of just doing what the majority does. We should always be critically examining these things. So when I talk about biblical anarchy, when I talk about Christ's kingdom being opposed to the kingdoms of man, this is part of what I mean. The state tells you that you're free because you get the vote, but the Bible and Jesus tell you you're free based on your knowledge of the truth and based on, of course, the gospel message of the freedom that we obtained from Christ. And the truth is this: you are not the government. You do not owe allegiance to the government, to the state. You owe allegiance to Jesus Christ and his kingdom, and to what is true and what is good and what is righteous and what is honorable. You are not responsible for the theft of the state, the violence of the state, the oppression of the state. But I think you are responsible to call out injustice even when the state does it, even if you, regardless of how you did or didn't vote. As Christians, our job is not to baptize Caesar's lies, but to expose them. We belong to another kingdom, and we serve another king, the true king, the only king, the only one who has the right to open the scroll, the only one who has the right to truly reign, the only perfect king who is also our perfect savior, Jesus Christ. So that's all I have for you guys for this episode. I hope that this was helpful for you. I'm really passionate about libertarian ideas and the gospel, and I just thought that this section from the Anatomy of the State not only has important insights that we have to consider as Christians, but that it ultimately, I think, can help us as Christians to remind us to live counterculturally and to live with that understanding and emphasis on our true citizenship being in heaven. So I hope this episode was helpful. I hope, if it was a little bit challenging, I hope that, if you don't completely agree, I hope that you pray on it, reflect on it, that you receive it with an open mind. Check out other episodes if you want to. Check out Libertarian Christian Institute, who has written a lot on and created a lot more podcasts than just this show on the ideas of faith and freedom. And speaking of faith and freedom, just a reminder that if you have questions about libertarians and libertarian Christianity, right? Or the connection between these two things. I'm holding this book up for the video people, but Faith Seeking Freedom, Libertarian Christian Answers to Tough Questions, as a kind of more of a question and answer sort of format, which goes through different topics. So if you're curious about the crossover between the libertarian and Christian worldview, that is a great resource, which you can find at libertarianchristians.com. And as always, if you want to support the show, you can head over to Biblical Anarchy Podcast.com and sign up to support me and the work that I do with the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you for listening. As I always conclude by saying, live at peace, live for Christ. Take care.
The Biblical Anarchy Podcast is a part of the Christians for Liberty Network, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. If you love this podcast, it helps us reach more with a message of freedom when you rate and review us on your favorite podcast apps and share with others. If you want to support the production of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, please consider donating to the Libertarian Christian Institute at biblicalanarchypodcast.com, where you can also sign up to receive special announcements and resources related to biblical anarchy. Thanks for tuning in.